Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval European cities during the 11th to 12th century. Just yesterday we were making a video about ancient Milan actually, but as a prelude to the medieval deal, together with Paris, that was essentially the largest city in the West during this time. And so you understand from also our medieval cities playlist and the main, in fact, urban context that we discussed, and hopefully we will keep also going a bit in detail with, which is something that generically on medieval history books you rarely find unless it's a book dedicated to the entire city, right? But not in these intros. And in fact, even today's video focus is more general. It's in fact important to sort of contextualize correctly the dimension, the comparative aspect of medieval urbanism, which is, I think, valid for a bit the entire Middle Ages as such. I think that pop culture, as far as medieval stuff is concerned, tends to come from a place where people tend to look mostly at where they come from personally, to make the association with the Middle Ages, right? This is not just true for us Europeans. This is true for basically all our offspring, let's say, out there, and it's totally normal in many ways. But very often, let's say, the common interest stops right to that sort of national, ethnic dimension, whatever. And yes, there was a Middle Ages, but what this was entirely, or what place, what relevance, of course, that particular country people owns, as far as, for example, level of urbanization and say, let's talk about what their cities actually were. That's not really, compared to the general picture, that's not really that relevant, because again, you just wanted to hear your own history, and Schwerpunkt deals with this aspect too, right? And you couldn't do otherwise in both ways. Meaning, what would be the point to have just a general picture? As we're just saying, and just with one of every single city alone, right? Even in a list of the latter, you would lose track of the comparative method. At some point you would have to just stop and trace back, or get back to all the data you collected and try at least to compare, right? This video is not comparative in an absolute sense. It's just trying to give a dimension to European cities in this time of actually acceleration, as you know, of urbanization, especially in, say, Western and Central Europe, so from the Latin, Germanic mostly, but also Slavic side of the story, in a moment in which also, of course, the surrounding cultures were experiencing a further revival, but not quite necessarily in the best way. For example, from a political or institutional point of view, essentially, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, suffer important blows at this point in history, and one can't help but notice that in many ways these empires had been based on a urban system, right? So it's not much the urban system that was, of course, defective as an absolute model. On the contrary, you have a Western European urban boom that is unprecedented also for ancient world, and you have to, at that point, answer why the other types of city system sort of went down, right? One could make the case, of course, that these cities were not present in a vacuum, and this goes without saying, but shouldn't think either that the feudal system per se was just the game changer in the West. It was, as far as that feudal dimension was concerned. It is true that would remain the basis and the substratum from which the same cities would evolve, but it's also a broader reason of identity, if you want, of cultural, moral factors that cannot be studied just through the cities, but that today we can sort of highlight in part as well. The arc of the 11th and the 12th century witnesses at the extremes the decline of Cordoba and the sack of Constantinople. Right, just to exemplify what we were talking about relatively to the Islamic and Byzantine side of the story. Right, it's something you must politically justify. These were big systems based fundamentally on what had still been the Roman model of statehood, stemming from literally antiquity. In many ways, of course, they were also more privatized and clientery, say, quasi-feudal systems than they had once been. But it is true that the idea of a single, say, uniformly governed state, a centralized one if you want, by these time standards, a permanent military, right, a large bureaucracy, was the model that in these centuries evidently failed. And one could wonder why, of course, in the bigger picture, but again, let's not simply do this, because otherwise we will never end this video. I did it in other ones, right? But in general, right, you understand that this decline is not just strangely happening for no reason. It's happening in parallel to massive Western European expansion. Also, by the way, and in many ways, even especially from a urban side of the story, right? This is especially true for Constantinople, that is hijacked by the maritime power of the Latins, and that is taken, in fact, from the sea, right? With a maritime potential that came from some Western communes. Cordoba is different, admittedly, and in fact, as we will see now, there is also one aspect to consider, that is to say, Cordoba is Spain, right? We're not talking in Arabia or even Syria or whatever. What you see also in the importantly different northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, the one controlled under the Christians, is still, right, a world that had historically undergone an important urbanization since Roman times, in some cases even before, and that sort of witnesses this shift in control of the same cities rather than, let's say, a world without city, or even in this case, a world with more important cities, because evidently the ones in the south were the biggest, the largest. But that's also an interesting point to start from, because one has to understand how wealth was actually distributed within the cities, whether the size that we will observe being larger in many non-European centers of the Mediterranean, being actually characterized by a lesser political dynamism, and also military aggressiveness and autonomy and more, right? So size is not everything, and this is something that for the Middle Ages, in a civilizational sense, is particularly evident, because the cities, again, are in fact discounted a bit too much in the progress of Western civilization, narrowly meant. The Middle Ages weren't all about, this sort of demi-urbanized or almost de-urbanized reality. I've seen recently a common, say, a very famous channel presenting himself like, with a historical background, saying that the Middle Ages were a moment of de-urbanization, right? Which is probably the dumbest thing one could. Means you have never studied a basic medieval history manual, right? De-urbanization in the Middle Ages lasts at the longest 1.5 centuries over a millennium, right? The rest is not just urbanization, but further boost of a much greater level of urbanization that had ever happened before, right? And this is, again, what still we go in, though, when I speak pop culture, not just coming out of, nowhere with this and just having an alibi. These thoughts are as dangerous, as widespread, and for some reason still held without any shame. So the size of Europe is important. If you say measure from the Volga to Portugal, right? You realize that we're talking something like 4,000 kilometers, right? And if you consider like the very top of Scandinavia, that admittedly was barely populated at all, so doesn't count very much, to the southern shores of the Mediterranean, so counting actually also the Mediterranean entirely, you have 3,200 kilometers. Actually, Western European civilization is much thinner latitudinally, right? And as we will see, also overwhelmingly concentrated in demographics as well as urbanization, essentially in southwestern Europe, right? And this is the point I was making. This is a vast area. Like, the European continent is enormous, but this doesn't mean, after all, that the differences that occur within it really should be considered just in a geographical sense, meaning that, of course, the least urbanized areas were also the least important, where less people inhabited them in the first place. So one cannot make the point, as some scholars really do, like saying, oh, look, there were some depopulated areas, saying, I don't know, in Central Eastern Europe, so this is not, look at, there were big cities like Alexandria of Egypt or Constantinople. Well, yeah, but aside from the fact that those are single cities that you're measuring by size, there is also an hinterland that really is unlike anywhere, considering Western European standards. And I actually understand we should make many more videos about Western urbanization, because the more you realize, we'll see it today, the more you study this topic, the more you realize that the Romans really injected in Western Europe as a whole, let's say in the western half of the empire, a level of urbanism that really makes what is the Western European civilization of the cities during the Middle Ages. Something that did not happen in what had been the more urbanized, actually, Eastern Mediterranean back in the day. And the reason being that, why, to make a long story short, but that's always the most important reference there, that why the Greeks colonized, like founded the cities, but they wouldn't actually care about expanding their territory inland. The Romans literally engineered, even ethnically, at least as far as the linguistic impact of, again, Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula starting to speak in a Romance language, this conquered lands through this intense colonization of the countryside as well, to an absorption, of course, not literally meaning that colonists were spread everywhere with that specific purpose, but having a completely different moral, cultural, and national approach to imperial expansion. And it's remarkable to see, in fact, how the most advanced areas of Europe were exactly these ones, right, at the time. And that is mind-blowing. And that's a narrative that you also rarely or incidentally hear, not quite making you reflect on what kind of engine was put in motion during the late Middle Ages from these very centers. I will also not discuss today how actually true the idea of the continuity of authority in the cities really is, even for regions that are commonly credited as not having been particularly, having undergone the severe deurbanization for Roman times, namely northern France or England, for example. It is true that the pattern is different, but you cannot really see a discontinuity from the centers of power historically in both regions, and even if there were different residences or also in the countryside, and sort of more the courts were more itinerating, which, by the way, for Britain is not even that true, because London is a quite precocious capital, so much more than Paris. It's a capital much earlier than Paris historically. The centers of power were always that. The church was controlling essentially all the dioceses from the cities, worked with the confirming exception of Ireland that was not Romanized, had not been conquered at least by the Romans and urbanized back in the day. So you see how exceptions aside, there is a pattern indeed, right? So needless to say, there was a wide divide, which is actually the same one you see in Europe today. Many people seem to embrace those sort of racialistic 19th century meters of judgment, but if you still today, and by a pretty heavy margin, the greatest difference, the widest differences between Europeans are between the West and the East, not the North and the South. Actually, as we will see later, what the chain of urbanization that affirms itself in Western Europe during the Middle Ages is pretty much the same concentration of wealth in Europe today, which also encompasses actually large areas of Southern Europe that are also in pop culture not quite publicized for the actual wealth that they really own. The world changes today much faster than in the past, but it's still, for this reason, worth acknowledging how much of the present is based on the past, and especially on the Middle Ages. In this sense, which means, as we will see better now, that the relations of power, right, political control, also spiritual connection, etc., are actually functioning on similar basis than the ones that existed in the Middle Ages. This is a concept often discarded by the idea that the Middle Ages were some sort of incongruent, intolerable, and unacceptable system of beliefs compared to modernity that is all different, and now some power shifted, whatever. But actually, right, what we call Western European is not really much changed historically in its quantities, with the few exceptions that are, however, also sort of smaller in quantity. In any case, we again, looking at this map of Europe, we definitely understand that this was a world evolving from not just a past, but also from routes that connected it to the outer one, right? Another myth is that the early Middle Ages saw the absence of traffic, or at least their greatest contraction, the fact that Western Europe was a sort of an inwardly looking system, that the Middle East, or this Eastern fluidity would have allegedly sort of prompted to grow, whatever. This is actually not correct either, and I can't make a video also on this. But great part of the influence that we witness in 11th, 12th, 13th century Europe, definitely from the Byzantine, the Islamic world, is something that the Western Europeans go picking actively to bring back to Europe, starting with the knowledge of where they would have found it. So actually at a level of not just of knowledge that was already telling them essentially what was present there, but actually crafting something, civilizationally speaking, that those same cultures were not able to do on their own at the time. I suspect there is a lot of self-sabotage in the historiography of the last decades regarding what Europe was really in medieval times. And still at this point, right, there is no doubt, again, that some areas in Europe were significantly backwards, right? But Europe, as we've seen, is huge, right? So you shouldn't conflate that in, for example, just by demographic distribution, and you should look at who Europeans were and where they lived, for example. And so talking about wastelands or incredibly sparsely inhabited areas is not really telling you what just a piece of dirt, right, was supposed to look like, right? That's a bit, diluting the impressive feats of where most of European civilization was concentrated. And it was allegedly this, in fact, rougher world compared to this other Mediterranean civilizations, which actually does not seem quite the case, and not to have really been ever more than much. And city development in here is are very useful patterns to adopt in this evaluation, because when you look at the Byzantine Empire, you realize that Constantinople basically swallowed all the other cities that were actual cities in the ancient world, not simply towns. This is something we will be discussing today as well. What are we talking about? What do we mean by cities? What do we mean by towns? Equally, the Islamic world, even after the so-called Golden Age of Islam, that somebody wants to sort of overshadow, saying, no, because, if you buy the full conservative pact, the idea is, you shouldn't never give the devil, its due. That's not actually the case. That there was a Golden Age of Islam. Doesn't matter how based, in fact, on previous civilizations, whatever. But there had been, of course, a significant relevance in these centers, and so there were the moral and the material potential, especially the latter, for further development. And Islamic urbanization is not this impressive actually during these centuries, nor it sort of manages to compare with one of the northern shores of the Mediterranean. I made multiple videos on these topics as well. There is one called Medieval Economy, speaking playlists here, and Medieval Society as well deals with this. Medieval Trade, if I'm not wrong, and you'll find there how essentially Western dominance affirmed itself already at this point. So, while it is true that some part of Europe, even the most of it extensionally, was somewhat backward, right, and peripheral, by comparison with areas south of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the bulk, again, of European moral material forces were distributed in a more efficient way than these other areas, right? There is no doubt that some communities, especially if you look at the Italian maritime republics, had been growing as coastal centers, centers of trade in the later sort of Islamic Golden Age within this, economic circuits, also minting taris, for example, to enter better those markets. Still, their growth is incredibly internal, coming from the within, right? You do not have any other evidence, right? These were not coastal centers, meaning that were detached from the interland, nor that, in fact, continental Europe had ever seemed to actually give way to. Also made multiple videos about the Saracens, and we have observed how, yes, there were big caliphal centers, for example, in Mediterranean and in the Middle East, in the Levant, but they were actually a bit more distant from the Mediterranean, the center of Mediterranean as such, right? They weren't. Yes, the Syrian ports were important. They surely contributed to harass the Byzantines, but these, for example, had a more concentrated naval power at the end of the day. The Abbasids were concentrated eventually in Mesopotamia, and the Caliphate of Cordoba at the end of the day was a Spanish thing. And while you have some Tunisian powers, Egyptian powers, you realize that even in the case of greater infiltration, Saracen infiltration in the west, so in the central Mediterranean, the Italian peninsula, southern France, you do not really see any state that is able to destabilize the northern shore of the Mediterranean politically or socially. You can have raids, incursions, but there is not even properly a demographic settlement there. And all of a sudden, you have these cities, in fact, that sort of literally boom and sweep from a generation to another. The Islamic presence in the Western Mediterranean essentially take over all the Levantine ports from the side of their naval power, that in its dramatic advancement in naval engineering, but just the moral force politically and militarily behind that was evidently a product of at best a sort of half-asleep civilization, right? The more you study the Middle Ages, the more you realize the continuity actually with antiquity in terms of manpower, demographics. Regions like Italy, France are overwhelming in economically, demographically, technologically, and civilly in the first place, which is yet the other picture that sort of goes a bit under tone a little bit. And for reasons I can't quite explain. I mean, you know that I don't like conspiracy theories. There is not. This, of course, this is a criticism I'm making to the objectively liberal-leaning historiography that was dominant up to a few decades ago, but things have started unhinging themselves. But nobody has, after that, really reformulated the paradigm for what I think the absolute evidence, quantitatively speaking, and qualitatively, especially even more, really shows in this degree. We have started to think that Europe was this more backward thing in the north, and then yes, there were this sort of mercantile republics that worked as a hinge in the south. But oh my God, how advanced was, I don't know, the Islamic world, and how much poured from there to Europe because these guys didn't know there even was this thing, and they kind of became a civilization later. That's not really how it happened. Right, there was a much sounder and constitutively developed backbone of Western Europe from quite a while, actually, and you hardly can see, even during the early Middle Ages, how much divide was there really between Constantinople and the West, or Islam and the West, and the chaos of the very precocious political fragmentation of the early caliphate is something that makes you think as well, because not just the Muslim powers were at the end of the day developing on the basis of previous civilizations. I mean, the Mesopotamian one, the Egyptian one, the Iberian, let's say the southern, the Andalusia. Yes, you have Tunisia to some extent. It is a fertile area compared to the rest of North Africa, but also how actually detached they were from one another. I mean, Islam was surely the greatest common element in this, and there was a lot of interaction between these systems, but they never were able to put together, like, I don't know, forces to the degree the West managed to do so in a truly universal sense, in spite of all its internal divisions, say during the Crusades, for example, or even just in terms of ecclesiastical administration. Admittedly, Islam did not have a priesthood, did not have a church, so that's also part of the reason why the system declined to an extent. It's as if Latin Germanic Europe, as apparently slower and sort of rougher to an extent, was able to grind its grain in a much more intense and precise and effective way, and persevering with that with much greater results throughout this very hard times that had been really for everyone in Eurasia and beyond. So the picture of medieval urbanization is very much the same. When you look at a city, you realize that it's about the surplus of the countryside that allows this towering thing, literally towering thing, to dominate over the countryside. And in fact, that the guys who live there are really the ones that lord over the rest of the territory, right? You have around the city a part of the population that increasingly specializes in crafts, that exchange that as other services, for agricultural products, and that in fact keep accumulating further in these true strategic centers. These were very militarized worlds, pretty much everywhere across the Mediterranean, Europe. Like, this is not just about the Christian world, and I would have some references and suggestions also from. There's a video about the Fatimid army organization, also the ones about the Near East Near East warfare between the 11th and 14th century, we realize how there were, of course, cities there too. There were local militias. There were similarities there. The Mediterranean, of course, again was a child, a bit of the same Greeks, of the same Romans. But again, and this is the distinction, by the way, between city and town to some extent. It's really the spirit that animates the urban community that makes the difference at a political, institutional, military level, social level, and that brings, in fact, some of these cities to simply even aggressively start to expand beyond their walls, which is actually an exception even within the same Europe, but that really makes them enter a much bigger play, right? It's not just like, in fantasy LARPing, like, look at the village with the market, it's the little thing. No, we're talking about massive infrastructural systems, right? Built with an enormous amount of material, with actual armies, level of proto-statal development at this point, capable of projecting their strategic force literally thousands of kilometers away at some point, and maintaining control of the surrounding countryside and engaging in fights against emperors and kings. And so this is not definitely normality, but if you look at this concentrating, especially in the Italian peninsula, as you know, and especially in central and northern Italy, you realize in that system there were 1/4 of the European inhabitants, right? So it does matter. It's not just a misrepresentation. It's not just cherry picking. It's literally a major bulk, 1/4 of the entire European civilization that is based on that, right? And this aspect from pop culture is being removed, right? It's all about castles and lords and whatever, but these were present everywhere, and they were the ones actually that had allowed even the cities to expand the way they did. But it's not the only picture, and these could have not happened if that massive chunk of the system had not been there in the first place. And they interacted as hell, right? Not just conflictually, right? There was a massive cooperation involved, right? In fact, I would say this is the point. In Romanity, there was a term that was the civitas, right? This is a Latin term that you find used together with other terms, especially the one burgus, burr, and there is a loose difference for which you could say that civitas is really more applied to what would expand as a city-state and a city proper, whereas the burr is fundamentally more like a town, right? But this does entail properly the sense of citizenship. And as such, the old Romano-Germanic idea, a universal imperial ideal that the freeman in arms was not just simply a commoner with a weapon, but was a nobleman, right? Noblemen weren't meant to be just the people that eventually and oligarchically took over in fact, feudal Europe, like especially from the third quarter of the 12th century. They still could have a very urban lifestyle in many circumstances. But were noblemen all those who had a cingulum militaris, who had the right to bear arms? It was an incredibly high sense of civic identity, of municipal pride in many cities in Europe, especially in this belt that, again, was, as we'll see now, was more advanced along that pattern, right? There is an ideology of civic life that emboldens these people, that can see, in fact, how powerful they are, because for centuries nobody had ever seen such amount of wealth, and especially in medieval times, no one had ever seen this so evenly distributed within these cities, right? There will be a lock at the top, as you know, just like for the feudal class. Also, for the patrician government in the cities in the third, fourth of the 12th century, they're really going parallel. They're not oppositive systems in a classistic or socialistic interpretation. This is exactly the same thing, right? But in this sense, you do have in some of these cities in Europe, literally the highest per capita wealth in the world at the time, right? You can't talk about larger cities, as we will see now, also very close in Mediterranean, whatever. But how did life work in these cities? There was a much more sclerotic elite that controlled. These were major sort of agricultural markets, right? In many ways, the feudal system made of them a bit the same, also in Europe, but never to the extent that existed outside of it, right? So do not be impressed just by size. And in Europe, again, there were the largest cities, among the largest cities in the world as well. But consider what were these cities expressed by. In Western Europe, they start emerging like mushrooms. In other places, that they would have been just mainly single regional centers. So you can't quite compare them in the same way. Europe was very crowded. The great medieval civilization before the Black Death was enormous. We can't even quite count demographically how high it went. Made some videos about European demographics you can check out as well. So the problem of the city and problem of the town. The city is characterized by, in my definition, by a sort of proto-statal development, right? And in fact, some of these systems will become proper city-states when they give themselves essentially a unitary power disciplining the various guilds fundamentally that exist within it. The guild is perhaps to sort of arts and crafts sort of based conceptually. Again, most of the cities, those who really ruled, were sort of the equivalent of the feudal class in a non-urban world. So it's much more complex and much actually less republican and mercantile than most cities during the Middle Ages are presented to you in normally. Especially they have some actual military capacity to take over other cities, right? This is, I think, extremely important because it's, again, it's as if a state was concentrated in a city. And you really have that. Think about, I don't know, the expansion of the... that's the only exception, telling the truth, but still in this enormously populated area, central and northern Italy, how Milan, Florence, Venice, throughout the Middle Ages, fundamentally managed to take over provincial, or depending on how you measure that, regional the scale domains, right? So that is not definitely just a town, right? Especially if it counts hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, and it has the most advanced industries in the entire continent, right? And it can field armies of 30,000 men on a regular basis. So as many as the King of France would, right? And that's how much we underestimate this, because that's yet another chapter in European history for some reason has not made it, and it to the pop culture, in movies, in general interest, in general notionism. I have tons of examples to bring that, also bibliographically speaking, right? The Cambridge Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare is shockingly, it's supposed to be like, in fact, what the title sounds like. It doesn't even take in consideration the major battles actually happened during the Middle Ages, because history, again, is not comparative or universal. You don't care what actually happened and how important events really were on an objective basis. You just bases yourself on what has been published or not published, and then you're going to assume that that's going to be enough. That's not enough. Especially when you realize that, again, much has been published as well, and you have not read it for some reason, which seems pretty strange. So the town is something else. The town is, at most, of course, it will have a unitary identity to some degree, but it will be ruled by an association of guilds, rather than forming some sort of effective statal control institution above it, right? Usually these towns kept being ruled in the lieu of that by the feudal authorities that controlled those areas. And of course, it was perfectly normal in a feudal monarchy. Urban autonomy is perfectly integrated within the system, right? The difference is not much infrastructural, but always political, right? What communities do live here, right? Even say in the feudal, say in the countryside, when you look at villagers, they technically are living within little communes within themselves. So the cities actually are something, again, bigger, more powerful, that I like to distinguish in a statal sense. But at the end of the day, the way any community would organize itself locally was a sort of mirror of that, right? And so that would be a village, whereas the town, again, something more urban looking, but not really having a unified system. In fact, it's not right to talk about city-states in Europe until the 13th century, right? That's where the Italian communes become that. But even those in the 11th to the 12th century, they were essentially, they were cities. They would have called themselves civitates, but at least they were not states, right? And so that's why I use in the definition before like a proto-statal system, because the differences were significantly marked. For example, the Flemish centers are really towns more than else, because also in their development they do not really emanate from very big also previous centers. This is particularly important. There had been different degrees of urbanization. Actually, Flanders emerged in a decentralized area that in ancient history had been depressed. It had not seen many cities, right? It's paradoxical. Northeastern France had been more urbanized to some extent, and yet it's the French monarchy that takes over the system and sort of chokes, in fact, the development of other cities. We'll talk about it later, because again, if you look at where the major medieval cities in the world were, in Europe were, paradoxically, they are still located there by scale of not just urbanization, demographic density, but also GDP per region, which is fascinating. When you look at France, for example, you realize that there's only one center, right? Paris. That's it. Yes, you have Lyon, Marseille, that are in fact the second and third most important, but they are south, right, of the massive center. They're not part of the broader of the Atlantic watershed that was dominated by the monarchy, and there had been cities there. But in French history, Paris sort of swallowed everything in terms of political control, and so those cities sort of died out. It's a bit like what happened with Constantinople, and in different ways, and the cities out there. The only true city that existed was Thessalonica. And you could define that even a town if you don't consider in fact the subtle development in there. But by size, that's remarkable. Paradoxically, even less urbanized areas in Europe would develop more and become richer through urbanization, as you can see, for example, in the Rhineland, right? But we'll keep it, say, for later. Now, let's stick to the main line. But it's something you must focus on, because it's counterintuitive to some extent, right? I will not digress further in the sense of municipal pride and identity that stem from antiquity, continuing throughout the entire Middle Ages, but it's also unavoidable to see it for Italy and at least France, south of the Loire. Many of these centers, of course, had retained greater autonomy, sense of themselves. The function didn't really change. There were administrative and ecclesiastical centers as far as the feudal states that controlled them with different intensity really were concerned, right? They had become lively centers of commerce, but there was also a general spirit that had made them so. That had not really much been a medieval re-edition, but rather a continuity of in the from Roman times, especially probably the coastal areas, and not only. the material support was from antiquity was quite helpful. Of course, Roman fortifications, buildings, etc., had favored just that political continuity, right? This is the reason why also in lesser urbanized countries like England, from the 9th century onwards, royal policies occupied themselves to establish fortified centers of refuge and of regulating trade and money about the boroughs, right? Mainly at the beginning for reasons of territorial defense, but eventually allowing also the even in a country where essentially the main center, truly the main city was London, right? The rest of England didn't really have much until industrialization in terms of something comparable. But there was this pattern of urbanization that included these towns and new sites, and of course the local rulers understood that they needed this cornerstone to facilitate government, to order just administration, to supply the army, to provide also with just a territorial presence. Sometimes it was a matter of, again, defense, of enclosing these centers from the minsters, the boroughs, of course, that English urbanization stems. When you look at the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and so the revived empire in the 10th century, you realize that the Ottonians had promoted the foundation of new markets and mints. And since Germany didn't have much of a had never historically had, aside from the Roman areas that were important, we're talking again the Rhineland and essentially Bavaria and Swabia, a real urbanization, because again, east of the Rhine and north of the Danube, really no real city had ever existed. These markets and mints stemmed from abbeys, royal centers like castles, right? So they began to agglomerate around these often fortified centers, just because also the abbeys, and it's kind of normal how many times in the videos about medieval Germany you see typically there is a castle on a hill, and then in the valley you have the town developing. In medieval times, of course, before that, not really having existed much, right? Of course, there were villages, other settlements, but we know that, of course, much of this did not exist yet by this point. And this dynamic we just traced was particularly evident for Saxony, the same heartland of the Ottonians, where again urbanization was previously unknown, whereas the Rhineland was instead the more active area in Germany, right? It had money economy, substantial towns. Cologne, the largest city in Germany, was one of the largest in Europe at the time as well. Again, the most important Roman city of Germany, in fact. And when you realize that, you see, of course, that the pattern is the Roman antecedent, right? When you look at Regensburg or Mainz, or it's plenty of also other smaller cities as well. Think about Utrecht. We will talk about it later. It's not that is not that important, but it does develop later on in history. Still from, of course, a Roman basis that had sort of course, followed some strategical and, commercial reasons that sort of reactivated, doesn't matter how mutated at this point in the High Middle Ages, right? Northern and Eastern Germany was different. It really, and it is still today. If you look at a map of Germany and of GDP based on the various problems, you realize that, of course, it's not just about socialism, right? In Eastern Germany, it's literally about, and it actually, the reason why socialism stopped there is due to this ancient boundary, right, as well. Just think of how that objectively impacts. If you look at a map of the Warsaw Pact, you realize that it's the same pattern of European division on the basis of demographic density since ever, I'd say, at least since antiquity. Right? It can't be a coincidence, right, that these countries developed the way they did to be another thing. Also, as far as some political lines were concerned, of course, it's not to say I don't believe in geopolitics, as you know. And in fact, this is not about geography. This is about, it is also about geography, but not even remotely close to being decisive. But it is because of what developed there throughout the eras, which has to do with mankind, not with inanimate objects. All right. So when you look at Central Europe, you realize that princely and seigneurial fortifications we observed just right now for Germany were the main engine for the attraction of mercantile and craft settlements. Right, at least some of these centers already existed, and fortifications could be built to control them. Right, but where the stronger the fortification there, of course, the more you could control. It's really a double threat, but also the more likely was for communities to be attracted there. Right, the most important centers were along river routes, favoring forced transportation, and of course, during the 11th to 12th century, you have a major riverine trade developing in Europe like never before had existed. It had always existed, but its reactivation in places like Central Europe, in Northern Europe, or its actually activation to court in history, at least from the levels of antiquity, in fact, was unprecedented. Right. You have also to consider naturally that these princely centers were in competition between one and the other. And so also the communities that were living under them were. We've seen it recently yet again in one of our videos about seigneurial Europe, that of course the deal feudal protection is actually a contract, right, for which the local community accepts in a way or another, depending on its strength / weakness, to depend on the defense of this nobleman. And so if you want that to work, you have to support this system against the competing ones around. And so you form important identities also politically that are not just, okay, these are the guys at the top and we are at the bottom. We are under that guy, which is kind of cool, right? Let's keep supporting that. And that's basically, again, the sap of feudalism. In spite of the harsh living conditions, the brutality also of the nobility in many cases, still there was a shared sense, and after all, a decisive moral majority of support for the current ruler, right, for the pride in being under that specific guy that was thought to be a medium with the divinity and the higher authorities, for sure, as well, that could favor this area of the country or not. So as we were saying before, the main terms to use settlement were burgus, burh, civitas, right? These were not restricted only to places of Roman origin or to episcopal towns. There is a variety depending on the preference of those who wrote in many ways. So it's civitas would be more resounding, and it's something that the more advanced urban centers would just maintain mostly from antiquity. But it can be used with different semantics pretty much everywhere, right? They are the common indicators as terms of some sort of urban status. The inhabitants of the burgos are known as burgenses, and from that also the term bourgeois, of course, because the idea is that in the majority of the system, the nobility was again at the top, and the guy living in the town was subjected to a nobleman that lived sort of far away, because the town was not so central. After all, there were many of them, right? And so they could be more easily labeled as bourgeois, a bit like the peasants, right? It was very easy to determine like who was a peasant in the Middle Ages, not just because the overwhelming majority of the population was, but because of the evident lifestyle, location, status that they would manifest just apparently. I considered, however, that again the medieval city was much more populated than the ancient one. In some areas, like again central northern Italy, you would have as many inhabitants within the city, right, and its suburbs, as in the surrounding district, which means that half of the people there lived in the city. Of course, many of them with mansions that were the equivalent of a peasant in the countryside, so salaried workers, etc. In that case, there was again an enormous amount of wealth stored in these cities that allowed this population to still gravitate around that. But in fact, that's a very powerful indicator of the say the scale of political power, factual power in absolute terms of these centers, right? The feudal system favored city development, as we were saying before. It was important to have urban centers to counter especially the nobiliar expansion, to get skilled, educated personnel, clerks, craftsmen, having also logistical support. Again, these centers were pretty large. They were not just castles. You could fortify them further, and of course, being the major fortifications existing at the time. So emperors, kings, and bishops would set initiatives to promote these centers. It's the case for new centers as much as old ones, right? There are important cities like Magdeburg, Regensburg, Winchester that are developing because, for example, they are the seats of authority and ceremony, right? The cities of great churches, palaces, and luxury consumption, as well as crafts and trade that were, essentially mirroring this production and consumption. But also, of course, international connections, surplus to be exported at a long range, right? A city like Pavia, that had been the capital of the Longobards kings, had even a longer tradition in that role. It was the seat of the Italic crowning. It was the city of the Palatium, right? The idea that, again, in southern Europe there were more stone structures, especially in the cities, right? Whereas this would become more frequent just in the fortifications in north of the Alps during the 12th century. And so they were also more representative urban realities for the function that there really had remained throughout the development of the Holy Roman Empire, right? You needed to recrown those places that were also fortified to sort of having a political leverage on these ceremonies and who could be elected or not. Baltic trade was also increasing on a more stable pattern than it had been the case during the Viking era, right? The latter had surely boosted the region's commercial capacity, but it had been very contingent. It was based mostly on slave trade, and if you look at the main centers established by the Vikings, well, they basically declined. There is no urban continuity for those who had really created as trade posts as new centers, aside from the ones that already were developing, in a very loose way from the Scandinavian hinterland in this later time, right? And in the Baltic, it's fundamentally the Germans that lead the way, also the Scandinavians, but in minor part, you have Gotland as an important trade outpost, and the foundation of new cities. Think about Lübeck would give rise to the Hanseatic League. So again, mostly a German-dominated reality that would be able, affecting the late Middle Ages, to still interfere with the Scandinavian monarchies and having more maritime potential than them, but also being facilitated by the sort of subtle weakness of the in fact, both the northern German and the Scandinavian principalities sort of allowed these towns, after all, to conglomerate, acting as one power, ideally. The Vikings had contributed to the development of Irish trade, which otherwise would have been pretty scarce. I mean, urbanization in Ireland owes much to the Norse presence. Think about Dublin or Cork, and all the major Irish cities are fundamentally stemming from, yes, pre-existing Celtic settlement, but especially from the further Norse fortified camps. Also, York had been at the center of those Viking, say, at least being encompassed by this broader Norse trade circuit, and was absorbed further, of course, by the English government. Also, as this important center, we have in Eastern Europe Novgorod, Kiev, right? The latter, of course, establishing a true state, right? That as a principality managed even to crush the Khazars, to threaten Constantinople. And along the major Russian riverways, you have all these various centers that also in this case do not really are really new, right? They had not known urbanization before, but stem from these internal reactivation of the system, aside from the intercontinental exchange. You see in the description of Ibrahim ben Yaqub, the Spanish Jew, that wrote about his European travels in Arabic. In the 60s of the 10th century, the gradual specialization of some northern centers. For example, Schleswig made a video about the area lived mostly on fish, right? This is actually, it's just a statement. It doesn't really or necessarily reflect the reality. I mean, you don't really have centers that really survive just on these activities other than agriculture, right? But still, right, it's like the Burgundian town, like Dijon was said during the 13th century, to have really specialized just in winemaking because of all the money they would make. They could be able to buy anything else. Well, this was not really true, but it sort of gave an idea, at least, of the increase in specialized activities for a market that was ever bigger, more diversified. Ibrahim ben Yaqub says that pit fuel at the big town of Utrecht was an important use. He speaks of the trading customs in the great international market at Prague. That was more important than Utrecht. So of course you have different also perspectives on how the cities would be seen, the centers would be seen. The long distance luxury trade at Mainz, which of course makes sense because the Rhineland had from quite a while specialized in sort of more international exports of weapons, and the main imperial courts were at least the main centers of imperial institutions were located in the Rhineland, and so from there they would go as far as, in fact, the same Ibrahim Ben Yaqub's Islamic Spain, especially at the time. So the city starts emerging as more than, of course, just a material dimension. Cities are a bit like the cornerstones of the world. The Europeans were particularly aware of this, and this shows you how aware they were about their own political and social reality. Of course, Jerusalem, for religious reasons, and symbolized the focus of faith, right? And it was cartographically at the center of the world. Rome was, of course, however, still the most important center for Western Europeans, and not only. In many ways, the seat of Latin Christianity was a full symbol, right? Not just of spiritual, but also secular authority. And pilgrims visiting both Jerusalem and Rome were often much more interested in Rome in their accounts than Jerusalem, even as good Christians. So this also tells you what kind of awareness that the Westerners had about the relevance of Rome and what is still held. And there's no need to digress. Perhaps I will make a video about medieval Rome, made one about the medieval region of Rome. But needless to say, pilgrimage was quite central for many town economies. There were many routes. The way, the Roman way, the way of France too, depending on the direction. The path of St. James in Spain. This crossed the entire continent. It was the imperial road from Germany to Italy. You have really different routes that start boosting further town growth along the way, and they are definitely supported just by the local economies. Constantinople surely stood out in these centuries as a massive center. Some say that it recovered its 6th century peak of 400,000 inhabitants. Surely it was the most packed sort of, say, all included symbol of European, city, as it was a center of government in essentially a concentrated fashion. When you consider walls, churches, wealth, manufacturers, markets, etc., the presence of traders from 3 continents, this was really something was really big. It was in itself a great symbol, right? So still in this centuries, it really embodied much of that successful continuity that the Byzantines had managed to provide themselves to their own capital, still with an effective government, in spite of the problems we were pointing out before, but at the expense, in fact, of the other cities in the empire. And this is why the empire became so dangerously fragile, apparently, because once you took Constantinople, was over. That's something that Machiavelli himself said about the Ottomans later on. It's practically impossible to take over France, even if you killed its king, right? But if you take down Constantinople, even though there is a more centralized system of some sort, like, that's exactly the point. I mean, in that case, it was talking about the Ottoman army. It wasn't quite the Byzantine army at this time. At least the strategic ratios were already turning in favor of the West, like the Siculo-Normans, especially threatening the empire way more than the Turks. But it's still a concept that is valid after all to explain some dynamics of the Constantinopolitan government, right? You have the imperial court, the palaces, the bureaucracy, right? Cordoba, before the collapse of the caliphate, it was put down by the same, ethically, by the same Muslims in the early 11th century, because there weren't the preconditions to continue this level of power to be achieved in the control of the Iberian Peninsula. I made a video about this. Like they really thought of the former as a universe on its own, where the caliphate had to control the entirety of Spain, right? And this was also, in fact, a powerful model of capital city proper, right? It definitely had a civilized life. It was sustained by military might and cash, and yet already at this point, much of this system had been infiltrated by the Christians, right? There were so many, we've seen it often, so many mercenaries from northern Spain that fought in the Islamic armies. There was a general awareness of the weakness of the caliphate strategically at some point, because these guys came as mercenaries but could simply raid within the same system. At a point we've seen the parias one, especially the cities of Islamic Iberia were to pay, and so there is a trade shift, right, that you see. It is the same one you see in the Italian city-states when at the collapse of Saracen power, right? All precious metals start being shifted from the south to the north, and cities are important in Spain, not as much as in southern France or in central northern Italy, but they do constitute a measure of the level of control of the Christian Reconquista, right? You have, even after the fragmentation of Andalusia, the smaller cities of the Taifa rulers that really shine for the internal organization, the institutional relevance that they would maintain with their communities, their militias, under the same Christian rule, right? I made a video about the Mudayar, and it was full of Muslims and Jews for centuries within the Christian-controlled Iberia that were to serve as militias mostly. There were also traders, craftsmen, but we notice, however, that this Islamic world, urban-wise, do not display the same characteristics of Western cities, especially in terms of political autonomy, internal organization, military or economical potential, right? These are, loser communities. Apparently also devoid of, again, most of the control on them had been exercised in a military sense. So the locals had not really had the room for developing particular autonomies contracted with the authority or whatever. This is not to say that they were ruled with iron fist. There was an important degree of autonomization of the single cities, but under still a local military figure, right? That in the Islamic world is also endowed with that degree of religious power de facto. So that is a big game changer. But aside from this, again, it's really the space that is different. The Iberian Peninsula is a world on its own in many ways. Yet there was a big deal of Roman legacy that the same Cordoba had taken on as an emirate, eventually as a caliphate, and especially in the south, where the largest cities really were. But again, they were sort of more, the closer to the center, the more that dynamic that we're highlighting for the Islamic world is true. Like, you could have this big agricultural markets, but not much of a real local organization, autonomy, like aside from the one that the state really had, at least compared to Latin Germanic Europe. And this definitely hadn't favored much sound basis for further development. So much so that, aside from the Catalonian world, where lots of autonomies as a Christian de facto led area, even when it was under essentially an Islamic clientele, would maintain some degree of greater communal development, whereas the Iberian hinterland remains essentially a feudal country later on. The cities are important, right? But it's also they are also less thriving areas. The same Reconquista had really affected the local economy, like had sort of stopped at some point major agricultural development due to the raids, this continuously contested frontier, and so everything had sort of militarized and feudalized further, right? You do not find a great prosperity in Iberian communalism, but again, the land is so big that after all, there is, and importantly Romanized in ancient times, that urbanized in ancient times, that has, it maintains some provincial autonomies that are at least used by the local communities to entrench, to participate in this broader raiding parties right across the land. And so there is some important, let's say, especially military mechanism when possible. We will talk about Spanish urban militias. They are important. So when you look at the rest of the Islamic world in the Mediterranean, you can look at centers that especially Europeans traded extensively with. One was Cairo, the favorite destination of Venetians, right, that exported slaves, weapons there from a quite long time. Cairo was really impressive with its fortifications, palaces, religious buildings as the seat of its own caliphate, the Fatimid one at this point, then the Ayyubid. It had commercial, industrial, and residential districts spreading along the line, and this was really an impressive site, right? This magnificent, powerful trade center that really looked even at Constantinople with some hope of comparison, right? But as we were saying before, these centers were not as dynamic internally, like from internal force and potential, like the Western ones, right? Reason for which even the mighty Alexandria was infiltrated by the Italian republics that could not, colonists could not really be dislodged because they had the control of the sea and then these fortresses on the same. Plus, was now, because of again of the trade balance, that the Egyptians needed the Christian markets, right? And they could at some point try to get rid of this Latin presence, but they needed it back after a while. They didn't want to remain cut off from the rest of international trade. This gives you a dimension of the expansion of Christian urban power at this point from the northern shores of the Mediterranean. I made multiple videos about the Italian trade dominance in this very centuries, the 11th to the 12th. I also made a video about the Italian financial hegemony until the 14th century as well, that explain a bit better how this mechanism worked. And then I made videos about Genoa, about Pisa, about Venice, and first, so if you're interested in that story, right, Amalfi as well. So another crucial aspect is how material resources were distributed within the system. Again, the Byzantine and Islamic world definitely show much less egalitarian wealth per capita, right? You have essentially the elites controlling almost everything, and thus you do not have that level of local political autonomy, whereas the Westerners really do a lot. Again, Italy had maintained the highest per capita wealth in the world, even through the early Middle Ages. This is particularly important, you see, because it's a relative measure, right? Absolute wealth over the amount of the population. And this, of course, was the result of various factors, but there is no denial that it mostly had to do with this heavy urbanization of the peninsula, and so the capacity of essentially distributing this wealth, a bit like in late medieval Europe, when at the advance of the Turks, that, as we were saying before, were sort of a unitary system that, however, sort of kept actually was born in the first place within the Byzantine world, that met with that sort of dramatic social stratification, in fact, and lack of local autonomies compared to Western Europe, where at the advance of the Turks you could have major assets with a very effective banking system that had been developing from, in fact, around these centuries, could move, transfer wealth very effectively and efficiently, right, from one place to another, aside from these onslaughts from the external. But even at that point, never think that the Ottomans were stronger than Western Europe as a whole, exactly because their bases were much less productive at the end of the day than the West. Doesn't matter how the latter was politically fragmented, and that's actually a testament actually to the local quality, because the West was hopelessly fragmented from a political point of view, and in those circumstances enemies can profit and will profit, but even then, like under the Ottoman onslaught, essentially the West remained standing, and actually even spending enormous resources fighting within itself rather than addressing the Turkish problem, as we've seen often in our videos about modern warfare, and still bringing the Ottomans eventually to their knees. Right. So, as we were saying at the beginning, Western Europe was densely populated. This is yet another important aspect. The major divide, again, was between West and East, which means that the Latin Germanic world was much more sort of developed than the Slavic Greek one, but that especially the differences between North and South were not as pronounced as the ones that had to do with the Roman legacy, right? England, yes, it's Northern Europe, but it was developed, right, to a higher degree of Scandinavia, right? Why? Because, of course, it's not just about the Roman presence, but also the reason why the Romans had pushed that far and not, say, to Scandinavia, because still Britain does have resources and climate and sort of a general location that favors further development. So the Romans themselves had followed that pattern and already laid some basis for further development. The other areas weren't like that, right? The same latitude, the West was more advanced than the East, and for medieval economy, of course, cold is quite damaging for agriculture. The agricultural the crops of the time were ridiculous and incredibly fragile, right? And change in weather was much more impacting than it is today on the crop yield. So still think this when you realize how impacting, instead in a positive sense, was the further Romanization historically in this territory, in the vestiges of that, and the fact that England, yes, did develop that, in fact, urban bases as well. Central Europe was less populated, and Eastern Europe was even less than that. Definitely the main centers of urban growth that, as we were saying before, actually correspond still to today's GDP concentration in Europe at a regional level were northern central Italy, the territories bordering the southern part of the North Sea and the English Channel, and the extension up to the Rhine, in part also southern Germany, which are, if you again pick a regional GDP in Europe, the same exact areas that with the highest, in fact, income, just as evidently they were in the Middle Ages. And this is no coincidence. Essentially, Europe maintained an axis of wealth, aside from, some cases. I don't know, the UK, for example, is very rich, so that because of industrialization, the British Empire, so that counts an exception, etc. But still, London was part of that. You see, England developed from that trade route, let's say, and of course there are other areas like Scandinavia, at least actually just Norway, because Sweden actually is not as rich as central northern Italy per capita still today. But they are smaller. The population of Scandinavia is very small. So overall, when you look at the major European industries, think about the Netherlands, Benelux, right, the Rhineland, and descending down to again the manufacture of central northern Italy, you see how much this corresponds also to demographic concentration, and to, in fact, the historical urbanization in the Middle Ages. This is mind-blowing, right? It's utterly mind-blowing. You see other interesting things, such as for example, that France has the bomb, and it has it because, it sort of developed as we've seen, just a more autocratic power, where the cities had sort of gone down in favor of the nobility because it has a greater military capacity, and so the country sort of functionalized in that direction, right? So the history of Europe is that intertwined with also the one of medieval urbanization, right? And of course, I will not here digress on trade route, but essentially what was the important connection between the English wool, the Flemish textile industries, the Champagne fairs, the ports, the Italian ports, the Rhone Valley. So that is yet another axis, in fact, of important urbanization to some sort. So of course, I'm simplifying by approximation, but again, certain centers of southern France were really important, especially at this time. Eventually, you have a decline in the 14th century. You had an important crisis of that route. And I made videos about this as well. If you're interested, I made a video about the German and Italian maritime trade volume comparison. Made another video, many about the European trade routes during the Middle Ages that follow most of this trade route, most of this commercial highways, let's say. But again, the urban concentration is also something else, right? And what is fascinating is also reading what contemporaries thought about each other's areas. For example, Otto Freising, that followed Frederick Barbarossa during the Third Crusade along the Danubian route, commented on the wretchedness of the Hungarian towns and villages, right? Also on the fact that beyond the Oder River in the east of Germany, basically the barbarity and sort of depressed agriculture rate, right? Naturally, this is a German perspective, was not very nice on the Poles and the Hungarians, but there is some truth to this. Of course, those areas were less developed. Germany sort of worked as a catalyst there for the expansion of Frankish culture. We've seen it in the videos about also Polish and Hungarian warfare as far as arms and armor manufacture, crafting. Some of you asked me the other day about that video about the Bohemian Knight, right? Things like, but would the Slavs produce the stuff locally? Well, of course they did produce arms and armor in the German style as well, but there were lots of imports as well. don't think that imports are substitutive of a local production. Of course, they did produce this stuff, so bear it in mind. But there was an outpour, of course, from Germany, and yet Germany again is sort of divided in half. One is sort of Western Europe, the other is Central Europe. And in fact, also some lands west of the Oder were not that particularly developed, but surely they were more in comparison to Poland as a whole, right? Hungary also had large spaces of steppes. There was some degree of nomadism still because of the various peoples that were settled from across the Carpathians for political reasons. So I made videos about both Poland and Hungary and describing a bit also the same urban development in these regions that is quite eloquent. Right? They were really different worlds, especially Hungary. After all, Poland would develop in some more functional ways, paradoxically. It would take longer, but sort of on a more stable footing, right? But comparisons are also for other videos in this sense. Giraldus Cambrensis, speaking of the Celtic fringe, was complaining about the Irish lack of silks, gems, precious metals, and spices from the east, right? And this, speaking of the general poverty of Ireland in general. The other day I made a video about medieval Irish warfare that sort of documents the sort of incredible material poverty of this country still at the time, compared of course to the Anglo-Norman settlers. So you understand that in this areas it's also somewhat difficult to understand what a city really, a town really is. For example, some Scandinavian cities got the status of communes, some charters by the local kings, but de facto they were just villages, conglomerations. They weren't even single centers at some point, and the objective was sort of abusing the others, right? In this sort of country feuds that existed between those peasants that couldn't even quite be reached that easily by the royal authorities that were mostly concentrated on the Baltic and the North Sea. In just a quantitative dimension of the smaller centers. So at the beginning of the 13th century in England, that was again not a particularly urbanized part of Europe, at least it was Europe as a whole, but not really for Western standards narrowly meant. There were around 230 towns, of which perhaps 20 or 25 were larger than 5,000 inhabitants. All right. The larger territory of the say modern day France, so encompassing both north and the south of Gaul, contained about 30 towns with more than 5,000 inhabitants. Right, and there was at that point greater urban density north of the Loire. Right, think about this, and this is in fact often overlooked, that the area, especially northeast of Paris, was historically very developed to some extent, especially during the Middle Ages. This had been the cradle of Frankish power, and for a reason or another, say the most important episcopal powers, but also some cities, some communes. I made a video about Soissons, for example, and his relation with the French monarchy, how they were used against the bishops to balance power, even in, again, the heartland of what was the French, the apparently solid French kingdom, to balance out things, right? And of course, in this later times, the centrality of the French kingdom had brought these areas to rise, also urbanly speaking. Poland, that was, let's say, also quite complex territory, not quite urbanized, evidently, but difficult to picture, because it sort of modified its boundaries, especially in relation to the Ostsiedlung. It's said to have had 250 towns, right? And the extension of the white majority did not exceed 5 hectares, however, right? In which, by English standards, that as we've seen were not particularly ahead, was still incredibly few, right? Even the smallest of small towns would have been larger than way larger than 5 hectares, right? Woodstock, for example, was founded between 1154 and 75 as an appurtenance to a royal residence in the countryside near the rather substantial town of Oxford. Was 16 hectares, which was actually average for the English small towns of this period, right? You have a new town founded by the Dukes of Zähringen in 1120, that is Freiburg in Breisgau, beautiful place. One of my favorite places of vacation was there multiple times. That, in fact, is relatively minute, even given the importance in the region. And that initially, however, at the moment of foundation, didn't cover more than 5 acres. Right, consider that, and I made a video about this explaining especially the history of the English peasantry during the 12th to 13th century, that of course the country was predominantly agricultural, right? And as such the most common settlement was the village, right? But there wasn't really anything much more in the landscape, right? So still new planned settlements in the 12th century were these kind of villages. And it was absolutely normal for a place like England. What you see in other regions is also the different degree of militarization. I mean, England was not really, during the 12th and 13th century, under threat of disruptive raids, right? Yes, you could have, I don't know, a threat of French invasion, but that would have simply substituted itself dynastically on the English throne, like the English would try to do on France as well. But when you look at the rougher places, like Central Europe, you realize that the degree of fortification of the towns was much higher. This was the case for Poland, that was mostly feuding within itself, telling the truth. But as we've seen in castellation, historically, it's very often an endogenous induced dynamic. And of course this means that there was a lot of violence going on, and this is even before the Mongol invasions that really razed to the ground, and really a lot of Polish towns that were rebuilt in the 13th and 14th century with much even bulkier foundations, stone, etc., to prevent this from happening once again. So again, in Western Europe we tend to diminish the instability of the systems, especially the more east you go. That's something you can arguably speak also for today, right? And speaking of the Rus, in fact, we know that in this immense territory, by the way, that doesn't even quite have a frontier neatly outlined, there were, as far as the Eastern Slavs were concerned, perhaps 140 towns, of which about 80 occupied no more than 2 acres and a half, and only 8 can be deemed as truly substantial, right? As we were saying before, this area had not previously been urbanized. It had also developed much on the basis of some international trade between Scandinavia, the Black Sea, the Caspian, the Middle East, especially during the Viking era and so on. So the structures were very new, right? And much of the hinterland was still very detached from the very cities. That's another very important indicator of city power, right? I don't know, in Italy, for example, the city had to always control every corner of the countryside. The entire rural economy revolved around the city, historically, since ever. In France and in Germany, you could find still some communities literally living in the forest and detached from the cities, but these were still essentially the center of power, and becoming ever more so at this point. When you look at Eastern Europe, a place like the Rus, you realize that the peasant communities were very detached from these towns, the princely ones. I mean, the local militias were fairly well equipped, etc. But as we've seen in the videos about the medieval Russian warfare recently, like the peasant levies were rarely summoned. First of all, because they weren't that effective in the first place, but also because literally the capacity of control in the same was scarce, right? It was such a wide area, still covered in forests and swamps. And consider, again, the same Germany is something that was being truly, say, fully colonized, cleared, reclaimed only in these centuries, the 11th to the 12th. So we're talking really about major obstacles, natural ones, that also for urban development. That's why, again, in Eastern Europe, it's just the great Russian rivers that allow these substantial centers developing into principalities to emerge in a consistent way. So it's also difficult archaeologically to compare exactly all the towns that existed at the time in typology based on different countries. We can't say that a small town in England, France, or Italy would count as a large one in Central or Eastern Europe comparatively. They were these difference of wars. Again, Western Roman Empire. Look at the boundaries and look at the distribution of urban centers in the Middle Ages. It's mind-blowing, all right? There is a lot in terms of villages that are also founded in Western Europe by the feudal lords that we were saying for England. But this is something that during the High Middle Ages had been going on for quite a while, and this was the result of some forced manipulation of the local communities. There was a lot of resettlement, of actual desperation. This, in spite of the boom of the entire system, these communities were not really expanding much because of florid investment, but especially in the northern part, because of really lack of enough resources to feed everyone. Of course, this is reductive. There was an entire net of interactions and brings to this. But if you consider the Ostsiedlung that I also discussed in multiple videos, well, you realize that those Germans didn't really have many other places in Germany to simply expand because of the local resources. So they moved towards Central and Eastern Europe. And here there is an interest debate also because of those deterministic ideas. Climate change brought to this new demographic. Then are we really sure of that? Because nobody really proved this historically. I mean, climate swings existed as in any time in history, but if you look at the political, moral, demographic forces involved, these seem to be really moving on the basis of simply concepts like, there was land, let's grab it, right? That's the decision. It's not like a molecular reaction of some sort. There is an agency. And these settlements follow all very, very interesting patterns that I hope we will come back to highlight in some videos soon. I already discussed this. I made some videos again. I think there was one about Alberstadt that was interesting around this period. But let's say that, again, one has to, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, has always to consider the general, the essential, and the detail, let's say. And if you make me search about that video, Yes, this is European expansion and peasant freedom. The Walser, der Conquista, and Alperstadt. That's an interesting video you can check out if you're interested in this dynamics. But there is a medieval society playlist currently counting 193 videos that always awaits for you. That received, well, not so many, well, more than 1,500 views, but it's quite mixed. It's quite large as well, so probably it's not that much. But just for saying that, we discussed lots of stuff, and I'm always glad when we can add yet another brick to this construction. For today, however, stop it here. We will keep talking, of course, about medieval cities. For today, however, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.